You know how it goes. A massive new project is announced. A mine, a dam, you name it. And next thing you know, it's erupted into this huge social conflict. It can look pretty chaotic from the outside, right? But what if I told you these conflicts aren't random at all? They actually follow a super predictable life cycle. A story with a clear beginning, a really dangerous climax, and just maybe a path back to peace. In this explainer, we're going to give you the map to follow that story. So here's our game plan. We're going to break this down into 5 parts. First, we'll look at the basic shape of any conflict. Then, we'll trace that scary path up to a crisis. We'll stand right at the breaking point, and then we'll map out the tough road back to a resolution. And we'll wrap it all up with a really key idea for how to think about this whole thing. Let's get into it. All right, first things first, let's look at the big picture. Because it turns out pretty much every one of these conflicts, no matter where it is or who's involved, follows this surprisingly similar pattern. And this graph right here, this is that pattern. This is our map for today. So let's break it down real quick. Along the bottom, that horizontal x-axis, that's just time passing. And going up the side, the vertical y-axis, that's measuring how intense the conflict is. So this one single curve, it shows us the entire story, from a quiet simmer to a full-blown crisis, and then, if things go right, that long cool down back to some kind of resolution. The best way to think about this is like a story with 2 parts. The red curve, that's the story of escalation. It's how small tensions build up and spiral into a massive crisis. Then you have the blue curve. That's the opposite story. It's that really tough journey of de-escalation, of starting to talk and finding a way back to stability. To get the whole picture, you've got to understand both. So let's start with that dangerous climb up. How does a conflict even start? And how does it get so out of hand? Let's follow that red curve right from the beginning. It all starts right here, in what we call the latent stage. At this point, the conflict is basically invisible. You've got a local community that has some real concerns, but maybe the company just dismisses them as nothing, and the community doesn't really have a strong, organized voice yet. But don't be fooled. Under the surface, that pressure is definitely building. And because those early concerns were ignored, what happens next? Well, people start to get organized. A strong leader, could be a mayor, an activist, anyone really, steps up to bring people together. They start looking for allies, other local groups, maybe even international organizations. All of a sudden, the company isn't just dealing with a few complaints, now they're facing an organized group and things are starting to get serious. This is the moment the conflict finally bursts into the open for everyone to see. In the escalation stage, you start seeing things like marches and protests. Now, it's really important to note that at this point, things are usually still within the law. We're not talking violence yet, but the tension is sky high. This is a real hot point where any wrong move, any little thing, could push it over the edge into a full-blown crisis. And that brings us to the very top of that red curve. This is the moment of maximum intensity, maximum risk, and frankly, maximum damage for absolutely everyone. This is the crisis. Things have gone way past protests. Communities might be blocking roads or even occupying the project's facilities. Companies might bring in security. Governments might send in the police or even the military. At this point, violence is a very, very real danger. And here is the absolute truth about the crisis stage. Nobody wins. It's a lose-lose-lose situation. The community is facing fear and insecurity, the company has to stop all its operations, and the government is stuck dealing with all the social and political fallout. It's totally unsustainable, which ironically is often the very thing that forces everyone to the table to look for another way out. Okay, so we've hit the bottom. How in the world do you climb back from the brink? Well, that's the story of the blue curve, the slow, deliberate, and really difficult path back to peace. I mean, this contrast says it all, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the total chaos of a crisis. On the other, you have the very first tentative steps toward dialogue. That shift, from yelling to talking, from confrontation to conversation, that is the single most important turning point. It's where the journey down the blue curve can finally begin. And that journey has 3 big stages. It kicks off with the really hard work of negotiation, then it has to move into real, tangible development, all with the ultimate goal of, hopefully, reconciliation.
Now, the negotiation stage is slow. It has to be. This isn't just about signing a deal. It's about the massive job of rebuilding trust that has been completely shattered. That takes real empathy. It takes people actually listening to each other. And it means everyone has to be willing to talk about not just the practical stuff, but all the emotional wounds from the conflict too.
After all that talk, the agreements have to become real. The development stage is where words finally turn into action. People in the community need to physically see and feel the results, the new clinic, the better schools, and what's really important here is that the community takes the lead. They become the architects of their own future, aiming for self-reliance that will last long after the company's project is done.
And that brings us to the ultimate goal: reconciliation. This is so much more than just the absence of conflict. It's a true partnership. The company and the community are actually good neighbors, working together based on real trust and respect. This is what it looks like to have a lasting social license to operate, that ongoing permission from the community to be there.
So we've walked the whole path, all the way up the red curve and all the way down the blue. So what's the single most important thing to take away from all this? It's this crucial idea that you have to look at the problem and the solution as two separate things.
Let me give you a really simple analogy that makes this crystal clear. Just think about going to the doctor. The whole experience is split into two very different parts, right? First, you get a diagnosis, and then you get a treatment.
Think about it. When you go in, the doctor doesn't just hand you a prescription. No way. First, they have to figure out what's actually wrong. They ask questions, run some tests, gather information. In our model, analyzing that red curve, understanding exactly how and why the conflict got so bad, that is the diagnosis. You have to understand the illness before you can ever hope to cure it.
It's only after that diagnosis is done that the doctor can prescribe a treatment. And if you follow that plan, you start to get better. That recovery process, well, that's our blue curve. It's the prescribed treatment, the carefully planned path back to health.
So here's the bottom line. You cannot properly analyze a social conflict without splitting these two parts. To really get what's going on, you have to run the analysis twice. First, you diagnose the problem by analyzing the red curve of escalation. Then, you map out the solution by analyzing the blue curve of resolution. They're two different stories, and they demand two separate analyses.
And all of this leaves us with one last, really big question. If this graph is the map of a long and painful journey, the real challenge becomes, where are the shortcuts? How can we jump from that red curve over to the blue one much, much earlier and avoid that devastating crisis in the first place? Now that is the billion-dollar question that every single person involved needs to be asking.